is Art Bowser. I am a follower of the Comics Alternative with the two guys with PhDs, and I just love it, and I am a Patreon helper. I donate a little bit, and you should too.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 157, a look at Steve Ditko's self-published comics. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at a lot of self-published comics from the legend Steve Ditko. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover price, but often the discounts are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in most months, you can take advantage of bundles where you can buy multiple comics from the same publisher for a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those books individually. And this month they have bundles from Marvel, DC, Valiant, and Vertigo as well. So check those out and take advantage of them. And also, I should mention that the books that we're talking about by Steve Ditko are available through DCB Service at a pretty good discount too, at 35% off. And you can get those by going into the other publisher category and clicking right on Ditko.
That's right. In fact, that's where we got our comics, at Discount Comic Book Service. So go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your Ditko comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, this is a special episode in that it's something we've never done before, but this is something you and I have been discussing for, 2, 3, 4 months, and we're finally getting around to doing it, and that is looking at many of Steve Ditko's self-published comics.
That's right, and this is something I've often been curious about when I first saw that that Ditko had started self-publishing. I first saw it a few years ago. He's been doing this since about 2007 or so, 2008.
Yes, 2008 is when The Avenging Mind came out,
and that's the first book, and then there have been along with several different kind of what he calls packages or reprints of earlier material. There have been, as of now, 23 issues of new material that Ditko's produced, and we are looking at the first 21 of those issues. When we made this order to get these books, 22 and 23 hadn't come out yet, and now those are out, but we didn't get a chance to look at those.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot to talk about in terms of this Ditko material. A couple things, though, I want to mention before we get there. We have gotten some recognition from a couple of different listeners. One is from Maggie Umber, And she wrote me an email because I had met her briefly at SPX a few weeks ago, and she wanted to let us know. She says, I'm a new fan of the Comics Alternative. The first episode I heard was where you talked about the Eisners, and I wish we at Two Cloud, because she is published through Two Cloud Publishers, had known about you guys earlier, because we would have mailed you a copy of Mary Naomi's Dragon's Breath. So there you go. At least we were able to get you a copy of Big Pussy in time. This is when Wolverton and I were talking about the Ignatz Awards. And anyway, she wants to thank us for interviewing Bill Griffith, Rick Geary, doing the Ad House show, and also looking at Box Brown's stuff with Retrofit. She said, I also enjoy your reviews, especially that you talk so much about Emily Carroll, who is one of her favorites. She said, we were lucky enough to publish a comics collaboration between her and her wife in our Little Heart anthology in 2012. So keep up the good work. I love listening to your show while I draw. You guys are great. Thank you very much, Maggie.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. That was a very nice message.
Yes. And in fact, Maggie has her first graphic novel coming out through 2D Cloud in the very near future. That's Time Capsule. And I think there's a Kickstarter on a bundle of books from 2D Cloud that ends probably by the time it's going to be over with by the time that this episode goes up. But Maggie, again, thank you for that kind email. And I also think we should thank Kyle, who maintains the blog, the Pull File, for listing us as one of his favorite comics podcasts. If you go to the Pull File blog, he says that Derek and Andy focus on alternative and indie comics instead of the superhero fare from the big two. I found this podcast to be a great source of recommendation and reviews to discover new cartoonists from small publishers that might slip past the mainstream news sources. Anyone who loves the indie comic scene should be listening.
Well, that's nice, and I get the sense that this episode is going to fit in with that.
Definitely.
Well,
definitely. So, again, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Maggie, for your kind words. And, guys, keep listening.
Yes.
So we're mentioning this as special, and I think it's only appropriate that this special Ditko show is also the 300th episode that we'll be publishing of the Comics Alternative.
Yes.
I didn't realize this until the other week. Looking at everything that we've done that's uploaded to iTunes, and this episode will be the 300th one. Now, this is not episode number 300 because we have a lot of specials, interviews, the monthly manga shows, young adult comic shows. But if you take all those and add them up, this one included will be 300.
Wow. So how many episodes of the show proper have there been?
Oh, this is what, 162, I think.
Okay, so we're pretty close to having twice as many episodes outside of the main Comics Alternative show review and discussion show.
I'm sorry, 157. I was off. This is episode 157.
So yeah, we're even closer to a 1-to-1 ratio.
Yes. So Ditko, what more can you say?
This was something that I was interested in doing a while ago. Like I said at the top of the show, when I first heard that Ditko, along with his collaborator Robin Snyder, have been self-publishing his own comics for the last few years now, and I was curious to see what they were and what they were like. I've been a Ditko fan since I was pretty young, and I got those early issues or reprints of his Spider-Man and Doctor Strange work, and then I was also a fan as a kid of his Charlton stuff, like Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and The Question. And so I was curious to see what he was up to, but also curious about this kind of phenomenon, which I think is probably fairly unique in comics, of a creator of Ditko's stature, influence, and reputation doing a self-published project like this at this point in his career.
Right. Now, you were mentioning that he's doing this along with Robin Snyder. Now, wasn't Robin Snyder the editor of Ditko at Charlton?
I'm not sure if that was where that relationship started.
Well,
I'm not really that familiar with Robin Snyder's background.
Yeah, well, however it started, there's definitely something going on there between Robin and Steve Ditko, because they've been putting out a lot of stuff over the past several years. Yeah,
they've been collaborators for quite a while, even with Robin writing work that Ditko drew for some of the big two.
So, there are a lot of things to discuss here, Andy, and you've mentioned that in terms of the self-published material, basically we can break it up into two components. There is the earlier stuff that was published, which are basically reprints. Things like the Mr. A, the 160 page package, Ditko's H series, and then the brand new stuff that began coming out in, I guess it was early 2008. I would guess that we wanted to stick primarily with the new stuff.
That's right, and maybe refer to some of the other stuff when necessary.
Right.
Because I do think, though, there have been some new Mr. A stories, for example, and the earliest volumes of the newest Ditko publications. Most of that stuff dates back to the 70s.
Yeah. And in fact, I think it was in, Ditko Continued, and then Oh No, Not Again Ditko is where you're going to find the new Mr. A stories.
That's right.
In fact, the titles of these volumes are really interesting. In some of them, you can see a listing of all of them. So if I go through the new stuff, and I'm going to list all the titles, but just some as representative, there is, as we mentioned, The Avenging Mind, Ditko Continued, Act 3, Ditko Act 2, Act 4, Act 6, Act 7, 7 making 12, which is the 12th issue, 12 of Ditko's 32s, and that's the title. And then there's Act 8, making Lucky 13, 13 Ditko's 32s, and it just goes on. And so we're now at 23 of those. You and I only have up to 21. So they're interesting titles, but even much more interesting packages.
Well, I was having a little trouble at the beginning trying to figure out the chronological order of these, because like you just read, you get to Act 2, but Act 2 is really the 6th issue of the series, and then around Act 8 we switch numbering. After Act 8 we switch numbering to number 14, and now the numbering is fairly consistent from 14 on. So it doesn't really necessarily matter. There are only a few instances in which a story is continued from one issue to the next, and that's pretty early on. Other than that, the stories tend to be self-contained. Yeah,
and even though there are certain characters or scenarios that keep cropping up again and again, even those installments in each issue don't necessarily follow chronologically. In other words, you don't need to read one before the other to a point. So, for instance, I know one of the ongoing storylines is the Cape.
Right.
And that one, you don't need to have read an earlier Cape episode before you read the next one. It gets a little different with stories such as the Madman and the, I don't know how to pronounce this, the ! Question mark.
I would say the Interrobang.
The Interrobang.
Because that's the punctuation mark that's a question mark and an exclamation point together is called the Interrobang. But, you could call it exclamation mark, a question mark, or whatever.
Well, Interrobang is much more condensed.
Interro. So, interrogative, Interrobang. Bang for exclamation point. That was the symbol for the bureau chiefs when we did the fake AP style book. But that's off the subject. One of the things you were saying there about the self-contained nature of these issues led me to another kind of like early comment I wanted to make, which is that you've divided these publications that Ditko and Snyder do into reprints and original material, and then within the original material, I kind of categorize the recurring stories, because most of these are recurring characters, into 4 rough categories.
Okay.
And the first one, the most prominent one, seems to be just kind of crime and adventure stories. So the Miss Erie, most of the hero stories, Madman, Interrobang, and so on fall into that category. And then there's the supernatural morality tales, and that's where the Cape comes in. Because in most of the Cape stories, somebody is planning some kind of crime. The Cape absorbs that person and kind of does something to them so that they see the nature of their crime and they end up getting caught on the other side.
Or what could become the reality, yeah.
And the outline I would fit into there as well.
Oh, definitely.
And the P mask, or the personality mask.
Yeah.
Where people go into this place in order to put on a mask that reveals their true inner personality. And then there's what I was kind of categorizing as allegories. And these would be like primarily the gray negotiator character, who shows up when two kind of abstract people are in conflict, and the gray negotiator shows up and tries to convince them that they should be negotiating, someone should give something up, and for the other's benefit, and so on, and then things happen that way. But those aren't in any way kind of narratives that are grounded in reality or in realism, and those are some of the ones too that in which Ditko's personal philosophy is the most noticeable. But the place where those are really the most noticeable are into this kind of 4th category, which I would say are akin to political cartoons, but aren't really political cartoons. But they're not completely not narratives at all, but are images with kind of words that are used in a very kind of visual and creative way to show the problems in the state of the world today, or some of the binary conflicts that Ditko's philosophy reveals. Does that make sense?
It definitely does make sense. And into that 4th category, you definitely have those comics where you have the Earth or the world that has a face, and many times, maybe most times, inscribed into the world are all of the ills that humans have brought, like crime, terrorism, theft, lying, so from the small and almost minuscule to the grandiose, all the ills that humans are perpetrating on both one another and on Earth itself.
Right.
So there's that. Well, I like the way that you've broken those down. I would include a fifth category.
Okay.
And that would be those comics that deal with Ditko's relationship or his views on the industry itself, more times than not with the fans. And you don't see these as often as some of the other ones, but every now and again they come up. And they're akin to the allegories that you mentioned, with Gray Negotiator stories, I think is a good example of that. So they're very much like that, but they're much more pointed to the industry itself.
Right.
So, but I think that I love the way that you break down those categories, and I think carrying that information in mind, if our listeners do choose to take on this task, and it is a task, to confront all of these self-published works from Ditko, because it's not, at least my experience with this, I didn't know exactly what to expect. And so when I first started to wade into these comics, and I tried to take them on chronologically, the earliest published ones up to the most recent, it took me a while to get my sea legs. And once I got a sense of where I thought Ditko was going in the various tales that he was telling, I could understand it easier. And I think with coming into these comics with the knowledge that if you group them into 4 or 5 different categories, that's a way to help you get a better grasp on what's going on in these various comics.
Yeah, and I think one of the last things you mentioned, that kind of extra category or theme of Ditko's relationship to fans and to the industry. I think that brings up yet another kind of prefatory element that I wanted to bring in, which is, in a sense, how to discuss these books, because there's almost a kind of, especially in those stories or those pieces that are about the industry and about fans, a kind of dialogic element to this, where Ditko is addressing some kind of fan or reader, and in fact, there's somewhere it's kind of flat out, like the Gray Negotiator talks to the reader, or was it Ed and Ida, the 2 cops, when they come across a murder victim who's a hero, who has all these kind of comic book related things around him, looks at the reader and basically accuses the reader of killing the hero.
Yeah, it's like a Grant Morrison moment.
Yeah. So I feel like Ditko himself sets the parameters for how to engage with and discuss these works. And that is that either you kind of engage with them on an intellectual level, and whether it is debating the ideas in them, or absorbing them and kind of transforming your own thoughts through them is one thing, or you're just not interested in this stuff. So I find it difficult to say to talk about these books to say the way we would another book that we might kind of wholeheartedly recommend to the listeners. Instead, I feel more like needing to kind of discuss these books as intellectual exercises and not necessarily as aesthetic or narrative works. Does that make sense?
Definitely makes sense, because I think if anyone approaches them looking for this with the same kind of criteria in mind as, let's say, you and I usually bring to our review shows, then they're going to be frustrated, when they pick up the first issue and say, okay, this story doesn't seem to make sense, or I've read several installments of Madman and I can't figure it out. I don't know what's going on. So there could be any number of issues, and I think that the way that you've described that makes a lot of sense. That you either argue with it, you absorb it, or you're just turned off and you put it down. I think that those are probably the three reactions that someone would have. We were talking about Ditko's relationship with the industry and his views on the industry, and not just the industry itself, but fans are a part of that as well. And this comes out most substantively in an earlier work of his that I think was reprinted in 2013, the Ditko Public Service Package number 2. Mm-hmm. And this is a long book compared to the 32 pages, which is about the average of most of these. This is over 110 pages worth of quote-unquote story, because it's definitely not a traditional story. In reading this one, and I don't want to go into too much detail on it, I do think we should stick with the more recent, let's say 2008 and onward, that material. But this stuff, the Ditko Public Service Package number 2, was originally published in 1990. I looked at this as kind of a jazz riff on his views of comicsdom, the comic industry, fans, and it seems to flow from one topic to the next. It's almost very fluid in the way that certain themes or images lead to another turn in the story and another topic of discussion, but still focusing on the comics industry itself. So, I mean, that's an interesting read, to say the least.
And that reprint was also funded through Kickstarter.
Right, Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm. And so you look in the inside covers, and Snyder lists everybody who contributed to the Kickstarter campaign at at least a minimum certain level. And if you look through that list, you actually see some people we know.
Yeah, exactly. People that we know.
And the same with all the subsequent works that they funded through Kickstarter for the regular series, beginning with issue 19 and following, and then for a handful of the reprint books over the last few years. So really about the last 2 or 3 years or so, Ditko and Snyder have been using Kickstarter to a great degree and to great success as well.
Yeah. Now, you just recently contributed to the most recent one, right?
Yeah, which was
the Mr.
a reprint of Mr. A issue number 4. And so I'm listed in that in that book, along with just a few names away from me is one Gene Cannonberg Jr., who is someone we all know.
Who?
Gene Cannonberg Jr.? That guy?
Never heard of him.
Okay. Well, I think he has his own podcast.
Yeah. No, I noticed that he is in 1 or 2 of these other books. It's interesting. I missed out by just a couple of days, I think, on the Mr. A reprint that you contributed to. So I'm going to have to wait till the next time they do a Kickstarter to get my name in one of those books.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to something to talk about in relationship to the main kind of core issues of the Ditko series, is that in that mid-70s stuff, like the Mr. A, you do really see the more kind of overtly philosophical and didactic nature of Ditko's work that then I think becomes more significant later on. to the point that I think the later works, if you go through the like 21 issues like we did, and when you talked about how difficult that was, and part of the difficulty is that a lot of the stories are kind of repeating the same themes and ideas over and over again.
Oh, definitely.
As a part of, again, kind of these intellectual or philosophical exercises, and that kind of repetition also manifests itself in a kind of repetitive approach to dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I wanted to mention was that the rhythms of Ditko's dialogue are very interesting, and I would say also unique to Ditko. One of the things, again, in taking all these all in at once, one realizes is that, for example, Ditko will very often have a character say a word and then, a noun usually, and then say a synonym for that noun immediately afterwards.
Right.
And I'm trying to find an example of it as I'm talking about that. But also in the more recent stuff, he also has characters speak in fragments quite a bit. And I think that creates also a certain rhythm. Characters don't tend to talk in complete sentences. They'll interrupt one another. And narrative voices tend to be flat. There doesn't seem to be a lot of distinction between the way one character speaks and another character does.
Exactly. And another thing that he'll do is there is markings for profanity without the profanity itself. So, you'll find a pound or other characters before words, and or even something like an X and an ampersand will be used for profanity stand-in. And even once you know that, and you've read this multiple times, at least with me, every now and again I would trip up on that, and I would have to go back and reread that to try to understand what had just been said in a speech balloon. You mentioned the fragments of dialogue. That's what made some of these storylines a little difficult to decipher for me, and some a little more difficult than others. If you were to ask me what was going on in the story Hero or the Madmen, I really don't know if I could give you an answer that I would feel confident with. Maybe the Madman a little more than Hero. Miss Erie, I think, is a little better to understand. That's like a Murder, She Wrote on crack.
Well, I think one of the things you're pointing to there is that you've got a handful of these stories that seem to take place in very similar milieus. Miss Erie, Madman, the Interrobang, and the later Hero stories. At first, Hero, when Hero first appears, he's kind of an allegorical character,
right?
That is fighting against, often the Great Negotiator or some representative of social ills. It's later on that in the more recent issues that Hero actually becomes a character in his own kind of semi-realistic world. So those four, I think those are the four. There may be more that do this. We'll begin with Ditko establishing the name of the city and the time frame. And so in all of these, the time frame is the 1930s.
Exactly, and they're almost interchangeable. Now, I was going back and looking at the first appearance of some of these stories. For instance, Miss Eerie, Madman, and Interrobang. This is in Ditko Presents, which I think is the 7th issue of, since 2008. And so with the very first story, The Madman, it begins in the setting description, as you pointed out. Zane, a prosperous small city in the 1930s, a radio interruption, and then that's how this story begins. And then the next story is Interrobang, Emic, E-M-I-C. So Emic, a small prosperous city in the 1930s. And then in that same issue, the next is Miss Eerie, Mizzen, a small prosperous city in the 1930s. And so that's how that story begins. And so this is when these three storylines that we see cropping up again and again in the subsequent issues, they all begin in this issue. And like I said, their settings seem to be interchangeable to a point. And in a way, they're storylines. Although I as I mentioned earlier, I do find Miss Eerie a little easier to understand than the others.
Yeah, well, with Miss Eerie, what I think that there's a good and clear hook in that story, and that she is in her private life, she has these detective skills, and yet because it's the 1930s, is not allowed to be a part of the local police force.
Right.
And so she's constantly getting praised for her skills, yet she has to take on this identity of Miss Eerie, which basically involves putting on this kind of fright mask and fighting crime that way.
Exactly. In fact, the cops even mention, I think in one of the first appearances of this story, they say that, too bad you can't be a police officer.
Right. So that's one of the few indications in these 3 or 4 series that the 1930s milieu is important.
Right. And May, that's her name, May.
Yeah, May. Yeah. In later issues, it doesn't feel like there's a clear reason why these stories are taking place in the 1930s, or there's even a sense that if you weren't to say this is this prosperous city in the 1930s, that it would even matter.
Right.
There's not a lot of technology necessarily dealt with, radio and newspaper, but those things exist. So I was curious as I was reading those stories as to why the 1930s. That also precedes the advent of costume superheroes as well.
I was about to say comics, yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that reminds me, talking about Miss Eerie, one of the things you'll find in a lot of these comics, and even earlier Ditko comics, probably the most prominent being Mr. A, and that is the trope of masks. You mentioned that May in Miss Eerie uses this grotesque mask in order to fight crime, where she just assumes another identity. And then there's the series of, and what is it called? P mask?
Yeah, or personality mask.
Right,
yeah.
Personality mask, where, I really like those stories. I wish there were more of them. And this is basically a shop that deals in masks. And it's a shop that seems to be almost ghostly in that at times it seems to appear out of nowhere and then to disappear into nothing. But someone stumbles upon it when they're looking for a change in their life. So it could be that they don't have an assertive personality. They wish they were more assertive, and then they just happen to come upon this shop. And the woman behind the counter says, we have a mask that can help you for the problem that you have. Are you willing to pay the price? And, of course, right there, that sounds like the setup of a Twilight Zone episode. It has that feel to it. And then a mask finds, or the appropriate mask finds the face for whatever the person is needing. And more times than not, there seems to be an ending that is less than pleasant for that individual, but not always. So there are masks there. And then going all the way back to Mr. A, beginning in 1967, this is a reporter, Max Grain, who wears a mask, and that makes him Mr. A. So there's something about Ditko's storytelling where the mask becomes a very important component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I'm wondering then how that fits into the kind of overall philosophy of the work.
The philosophy of his work. Are you talking about the objectivist of philosophy that we see coming out in his comics?
Yeah. So, and this also ties back to his view of the industry as well. But that the objectivist philosophy most clearly manifesting itself is that there are clear distinctions to be made between good and evil, and there are no kind of gray moral areas between those. Either good is rewarded, evil is punished, and that ties into the comic industry and to the sense of heroes is that superheroes need to be superheroes. The kind of A is A philosophy of objectivism. If a character is a superhero, then they're going to behave in this way. They are going to be heroic. And the industry's tendency to try to, for the sake of complexity or whatever, make superheroes who have a dark side, who are anti-heroes and so on, is going against the basic idea of what a superhero should be.
Right. And we see that especially since the 1980s.
Right. And so is the mask, at least for the superhero, it seems like in Ditko's work, the mask is a way for the truly moral, good person to function in an immoral world.
Well, that would make sense, especially if we look at the example of Mr. A, because his mask is completely white, correct?
Yeah, and it is a human face
without expression, though.
Without expression, right? And it as it shows on the back cover of that Mr. A book, it's like almost like a helmet that he puts on. It has a back and a front that lock together.
Right.
So it is the full head, and Mr. A is clearly a descendant of the Question, Ditko's creation, who had no face and fought crime in a suit as well. But yeah. So that is definitely and both the Question and Mr. A have as their alter egos reporters. And they're reporters. With Mr. A, it's Rex Grain, and with the Question, it's Vic Sage, who are constantly being told by their superiors or by other reporters that they need to be more compromising. They need to give in. They need to be going with the flow better, and they remain iconoclastic, and therefore are at the receiving end of significant abuse and conspiracies to bring them down.
Right.
And so that that mask then becomes a part of that, the way that type of figure needs to function in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, the most recent, I guess, incarnation of the question is Renee Montoya.
Yeah, but we can't. I think Ditko would probably be disavowing any of the post Ditko question stories to begin with.
Right. Yeah. But that's how it has evolved. But even the way you were describing the reporter's dilemma, it's not that dissimilar from Montoya's. We do see her as a character who kind of stands outside. I don't know if I'd call her iconoclastic, maybe to a point. Mm-hmm. But now, this all makes sense, and I think applying the way that we read Mr. A makes sense as when we look at Miss Erie. It's a little different, though. The function of the mask is different with the stories that the personality mask,
right.
P masks,
right.
Because in that sense, there are times where the mask does have some kind of redemptive value to it, something more positive. But on the other hand, there are those instances where the wearing of the mask becomes problematic and has quite a negative effect on its wearer.
Yes.
So, but I think that's an interesting trope that Ditko keeps coming back to, is this use of masks in his stories. Not all of them, but in many of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, getting back to this philosophy of heroism and the superhero. So the stories that deal with Ditko's view of the comic industry basically accuse fans of wanting their heroes to be anti-heroic, and of the industry itself of giving into that demand and making their heroes unheroic or anti-heroic, and therefore not heroes in Ditko's argument. And part of the way he engages that as well is the kind of counter argument. Well, wouldn't it get boring to tell the same stories over and over again with these goody good heroes? And his argument is basically that's not the case. We have a long history of characters who do this, who behave a certain way and follow certain expectations, and yet those stories are still viable, and so on. Now, I say that in wondering how the stories that he does here hold up in relationship to that idea.
What, do you have a view of that?
I don't know that. One of the things I was challenging myself with as I was reading these is that I found myself often saying something like, "Well, I really wish Ditko would do this," or I would really like to see what his kind of ideal vision of what the world should be is, and then I kept catching myself because that's not within the parameters that these books set for review and discussion or whatever. Saying I wish Ditko would do something that he's not doing is not viable. Right? He's giving us what he wants to give us. If it is not satisfying, then go elsewhere.
Right.
So to say that, I would like to see these heroic stories be kind of more clearly distinguished from one another, or to follow different kind of narrative paths, but with the same kind of ultimate goal in mind that good punishes evil, is to say that I wish these were not the books that they are. So I don't know if I really struggle with trying to come up with a answer to this. How should I feel about this? Does that make sense?
That makes sense. As you were talking, I was going through some of these issues, and there's a lot. So, in fact, one of the challenges of an episode like this is there's so many comics to pull from. It's like, well, which one do you pick up as an example of a particular story or a point that you're making? But in the issue number 20 that came out last year, 2014, toward the back there is, and usually these stories very short, just a few pages about his relationship or his thoughts on fans, comic readers. They usually occur toward the end of each issue, and this one I think is the last story or one of the last ones. I don't know if this is the title of it, but at the top of the page it says "The New Anti-Hero Comic Book Transform Us." Mm-hmm. So, and you have characters that come up every now and again, and these are two fans that become Fan Man and Fanboy, and both of them have the word "anti" on their or "anti" on their shirts,
right.
And so they're big into anti-heroes, and of course that's what Ditko seems to be critiquing. There is this insistence on comic readers, and might I add, I think these are stereotypical comic book readers who really thrive in complicated heroes that aren't really heroes who are anti-heroes. So and that works against this kind of white and black philosophy that we see coming out in many of these comics. So in this particular story, which is in issue number 20, this is where the Fanboy and Fan Man, the antis, come into play with the Gray Negotiator. I think it's the one story where those two storylines converge. But in an earlier issue, and I was picking out Ditko Act 3, there is a very short piece toward the back that looks like the same general characters as Fan Man and Fanboy. In other words, you have two fans, and they're not necessarily talking about anti-heroes, but they're kind of running back and forth, almost looks like a frantic manner. And one says, "You hear the latest?" And the other one says, "No, what?" The other says, "He did it again. Oh, no. Hear that? Yeah, he ignored us again. Why? Why doesn't he listen? To us. We always know what is best for others. It's not fair. We want to have our way." And of course, who they're talking about here, you assume, is Ditko himself, although it could be, just the comic creator in a broader, more general sense. In that is this philosophy of fans, according to the way that Ditko writes them, or the expectation from the fan that the creator should be beholden to the reader. In other words, that the reader deserves the right to ask questions, that the reader, the comic fan, deserves the right to understand and critique and to get into the life of the artist, which is what Ditko is pushing against. And I think these are the same kind of characters we see with the anti-hero fans. So, it's an interesting relationship that Ditko's playing out here with comics readers.
Yeah, and it shows a couple things. It shows that at some level Ditko is engaged with the comic industry today, whether it is, through, for example, in some of the essays he cites specific interviews with people in the industry that are available on the internet. So he does engage there. I don't know how many comics he reads in order to kind of see these trends that he's critiquing. But he also seems to, in addition, engage with fans at some level in order to kind of see, because those things that you talked about, especially in that earlier issue, seem to be reacting to something,
right?
That he's getting, and what that seems to be is that that fans are demanding, for one thing, some kind of interview, him to do some kind of interview where he answers questions about his time at Marvel and the things that Stan Lee has said and his feelings about who created what characters and so on. And his response to that is he's already told those stories. Those things are out there. From his point of view, you can get those. There's nothing more to say about this, and that somehow the interview will make it truer than his own narratives of that time period. Right. But that's also part of the fans' demands. Then the fans are demanding that he do these things, that he answer these questions, and that's not necessary. So I can imagine if he is getting a lot of response from fans or from comic fans who are, placing these demands on him, that would definitely be his view of the industry would be based on that. His view of comic fans would be based on that.
Right.
But I wonder just how much he is aware of, for example, the sympathy that a lot of fans have for his point of view, especially in the kind of Stan Lee versus Steve Ditko narratives that are out there of like who's right and who's wrong. That most fans, when I've had these conversations with people, kind of are immediately suspicious of Stan Lee's version of any story, because they're often self-promoting and often kind of veiled in that affable hucksterism that's Stan Lee's public persona, whereas Steve Ditko seems to be is an intensely honest person, and kind of thrives on, or not thrives on, but demands that people who work with him or people who engage with him behave honestly, and if they don't, they're pretty much done, right? So for there to be this kind of fan voice out there that's kind of demanding that he do an interview, or demanding that he see Stan's point of view, which is another criticism he has in some of these comics about comic fans, is I just wonder how prominent that is amongst comics fans, or is the kind of sympathetic view, or the view that's more sympathetic to Ditko's position than it is to Stan Lee's position.
The comics, in some of them, where he deals with the fans, they appear as reporters as part of the I Inquirer, EYE Inquirer. Mm-hmm. And there are two of these, I guess we can call them reporter fans, and each of them have a different size or different shape of magnifying glass, kind of like a detective. One is round, and then the other is squared or rectangled. And every now and again they'll approach, and I guess they're magnifying glasses. I don't think they're microphones. They approach artists or other kind of figures, and they're wanting to know information. As you were talking a moment ago about, or I guess speculating on Ditko's awareness of fans who may be more sympathetic to him, I have to say that in reading through all of these comics, the tone that is struck between him, or what it seems to be his attitude toward readers, toward comic fans as a whole, isn't positive in any way. I don't see anything sympathetic come out at all, and maybe I'm missing that. And this kind of almost cynicism comes out in other ways in the comics. I mean, there's one in particular that I can't recall which issue, is when you have a cosmic interaction, and I literally mean cosmic, where you have things like comets and planets that are pointing to Earth and saying, I'm glad I'm not a part of that, all the stuff that's going on down there. Or there's one where comets are coming by and they go, I wish my trajectory were different where I can just bash into it and end everything because there's nothing good that goes on there. I mean, that's really some dark stuff.
Yes. And that leads to my other question that I posed earlier is what would the world in which Ditko's philosophy of objectivism played out, what would that world look like? We only get kind of hints of that every once in a while. There's some Gray Negotiator stories, for example, where the Gray Negotiator tries to convince some people to negotiate, to give something up for themselves, for the greater good, and so on. And they refuse to because their world is fine. They don't operate that way. And so those are the few stories where you get a hint that this is what that kind of world would be like. That's how people would engage with one another, and so on. But we more often see the kind of individuals who struggle against a world of collectivism and negativity and compromise and so on. That is the way the world is envisioned.
Exactly. And, I mean, sometimes they're characters, and the Gray Negotiator is probably the best example of this, where, well, they represent the grayness, the ambiguity, this sense of compromise, this both and instead of either or. And they're not presented in the most attractive light. The Great Negotiator himself is a clown figure or clownish character who is bumbling, whose intentions may seem to be good, but always ends up doing the wrong thing. And even when there are examples of characters who are like the Great Negotiator that are less allegorical, and many times those come in the form of social workers, right? They're attempting to do the right thing, but they're doing it, according to Ditko, for the wrong reasons because they don't understand the ramifications of this philosophy of grayness, if we could call it that. And actually, we see this in the very first Mr. A story that came out in 1967 in Wits End number 3. So it goes way back, but these characters aren't very complex at all. So when Ditko, and I think he has to do this given the philosophy, when he's setting up these arguments, these are very two-dimensional characters. Mr. A is a very two-dimensional character. The other characters that are very much like him, for instance, the individual with A is A on his shirt that just walks by. He never says anything, but he walks by every now and again, is a very two-dimensional character. The social workers, the police officers, the political leaders, they're very two-dimensional characters. And so this kind of roundedness is not the kind of figure that you'll get in the vast majority of these Ditko stories because they just wouldn't serve its purpose.
Right. And so that leads me to a question. If you had to define the kinds of villains that the heroes in these stories fight, what kind of categories would they fall under? Or what types of bad guys are the heroes fighting?
Okay, now are you talking about the storylines where there is an overt hero?
Yeah.
More times than not, they're the classic villains, right? They're the gang leaders, the hitmen. The big time gamblers who are just controlling other individuals and primarily taking away choice and
Right.
freedoms from other people, whether it be the hero or those close to him or innocent victims. And another way that all of his villains are defined, even those that at least on first glance appear a little impregnable or kind of majestic, right? That they're going to stand up against everyone. Almost all of his villains fall back on, well, why not me? Why can't I get mine? I didn't earn it, but I still deserve it. And they all, it's almost as if even the most imposing villainous figure turns into a little kid crying out, I want, I deserve.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's interesting that, you mentioned that they're all pretty much are in most of those stories gangsters, and they express this kind of philosophy of I don't deserve it, but I'm going to take it, or a philosophy really of force. And force is a word that shows up a lot in Ditko as part of the negative or anti side of the equation.
And isn't force in those Great Negotiator stories? There are a couple of other characters that are basically a pair, a twin pair. There's force and violence.
Right.
So he personifies that.
Yeah, in those stories. So there's the kind of allegorical representation of the conflicts that go on then in the more heroic narratives. But then kind of in between the hero and the villain is this voice of the masses that Ditko very often represents as well, usually as a series of indistinguishable heads with balloons over them that will say things like, there's just no way to stop these people. We just have to give in, or who is going to take responsibility here, and things like that. So there is the kind of weak and paralyzed public that is between the hero and the villain, but because they're paralyzed and unwilling to take things into their own hands and to make the better world, they are the ones that are the compromisers, so that therefore they are on the side of evil.
Exactly. In fact, as you were speaking, I was wondering, if I pick up just any issue, will I find one of those examples of those indistinguishable heads, or the group of heads? And I'll be damned if I just picked up, just random Ditko Act 5, and I opened it up to page 2 and 3, the first thing I opened, and I see two examples of that. On page 2, this is in a Madman installment. We have this group of heads, some of which have faces, some of which are like eggs, very indistinguishable. And the speech balloons above them, and again, they're indistinguishable. You don't know who's saying what. When will matter get caught? Who is hiding, helping him? I'm inquiring. Disrupts all my plans. I'm scared to go out. Why doesn't someone do something? I demand something be done. Not fair. Please. I'm praying to end this. And then on page 3, you have something very similar. This string of heads. I have to operate. Others too scared. My chance. Can expand. Big payoff. I'm small. Peanuts. Can score better. Yeah, risk it. When will matter show? Who's his next victim? Yeah, crossed him once. Really crazy now. Always a clever lone wolf. So, and you'll find these over and over again, and it's really funny out of context, and sometimes maybe even in context. Those various words from the crowd of heads may not make the most sense.
Right, and I think with the first group that you read is that kind of general public group. The second group seems to be the criminals and the criminal kind of underworld who are trying to either take advantage of or hide from whatever the conflict and chaos that Matter or Madman has introduced into the underworld.
Right, because even having gone all the way up through issue number 21 of this, I guess, this new self-published series, relatively new self-published series, I'm still not exactly sure what's going on in that storyline, Madman. I mean, I know that Matter is looking for someone who made him mad or who allegedly made him mad, who changed things with him. That's a confusing storyline. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. And there are a couple of authority figures. There's a detective and there's a doctor. Yeah, I think
is there a judge in that one? Or
and there's a judge, but the judge is crooked.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those that I had a hard time figuring out, and still have a hard time figuring out what's going on with that one.
Right. So I think that what we gave there is kind of a sense of what the way a lot of these stories end up being, with that kind of plot. Here's someone who's dangerous. The public wants to know who's going to stop them because they aren't going to do anything about it. And the hero has to act, has to be the one who acts.
Right.
And when you mentioned earlier that Miss Eerie is one of the more engaging of these series, I think that's also because beyond that kind of really abstract idea of how is the hero going to act, you have a character who is forced by the circumstances of the world she lives in to do something different, to take her skills as a detective and as a crime fighter and use them on her own because the system won't allow her to participate in it in any other way.
Exactly. And another reason why, at least for me, the Miss Eerie stories are a little more comprehensible and also a little more enjoyable in that each of them is a done-in-one tale. With each Miss Eerie story, it's just that story. There's no serialization. There's no carryover from a previous installment of Miss Eerie. Whereas the storylines in Terabang, the Madman, and the Hero, the story picks up where the previous installment left off. And so if it's been a couple of issues since the previous one, you could go back and reread what happened in the earlier one or two installments. But I don't even know if that's going to help understand what's going on in the current one that you're reading. And I think this gets back to something that we mentioned earlier. If you're looking for a more, I don't know if you want to call it a more traditional way of reading narrative with the Steve Ditko stories, you're going to be frustrated. And I think one of the ways of approaching many of these stories, not all of them, but many of them, is just to kind of don't try to figure them out, to try to read them, to absorb them, to let them go, to let them flow, and just see what the larger picture looks like. So, for instance, you may not understand, such as I don't, what's going on with the Madman storyline. But if you read enough of them, you start to understand the essence of what's going on, even though that essence may be a little amorphous. You can pick out some things and some movements that the storyline seems to take every now and again, and you can see maybe somewhat of a pattern, and I think that may be enough with many of these stories.
Yeah, I think so. one of the things I wanted to talk about too while we were talking about these books is the art, if we could.
Oh, of course, because this is Ditko we're talking about after all.
Yes, and as I was reading these books, especially when you can look at the reprint work and look at the current work and see the really kind of dramatic differences in Ditko's style, but also the recognizable signatures of Ditko's art. But I was reminded of when we were talking to Dean Mullaney, and he was mentioning how with Alex Toth strived for this simplicity throughout his career and improved over time in order to kind of reduce comic art to this minimalism that Toth was extraordinarily successful at. In comparing Ditko's 1970s work that we get in some of these reprints to his work today, it does seem like that's there as well. That his work is striving now towards a real simplicity of line and image that is giving you just enough visual information to convey the scene.
Oh, exactly. And it when you compare the art that you see in the more recent comics, let's say from 2008 onward, with the reprint stuff, for instance, in the the package collections, or let's say the Mr. A collection,
right.
There's a stark difference, and there's even a starker difference if you go back to look at some of his earlier self-published stuff. For instance, going back to those two Wits End stories, the two Mr. A's, and again, an even cleaner art than you get in the later Mr. A stories. But then the most recent stuff, you're right, it's just a series of a few simple lines, and in fact, and I'm looking at issue number 17 of this new series, where the simple lines themselves seem to break down. There's one storyline we haven't discussed yet, and this is the Distorter.
Yeah, I was trying to remember what that one was.
Yeah, that's a weird one, and this is a series of episodes where someone, usually a villain, someone who's up to no good, attempts to do something or is trying to do something, and some kind of force, I assume a distorting force, hits this person and causes them, I don't know, to get all funky, to distort themselves. And in this particular story, in issue number 17, this one is called The Distorter and Who Will Lead. And you have these three men who, I guess they're businessmen together, and they're deciding who's going to do what. And the Distorter, this force, hits all three of them, and they begin turning into these amorphous shapes. But then the shapes that like squiggly lines and angled beings, but even those shapes begin to break down and become even more indistinguishable than just amorphous shapes. So, and here we have an example of the art itself, which starts off semi-realistic, nonetheless, simple art, breaking down into much barer elements.
Yeah, the Distorter is a good example. I think the Cape stories occasionally get into that too, as a character enters the Cape and the world becomes distorted as well. But Ditko's doing something really interesting in all those stories with abstraction and geometry. Some of the Distorter stories where a person's face is made up of just little, kind of pointillistic dots.
Exactly. Yeah, you'll find that a lot in the Cape.
Yeah, are really. I mean, they're really showing the inventiveness that Ditko is trying to work. Is working through in these different stories. And so, I think someone coming to these recent works without having seen, with having an impression of Ditko's work from, say, Spider-Man, or even from the 60s and 70s stuff is probably going to be shocked by the difference in the art, and yet there are moments in which, like those you mentioned there, where the creativity is really apparent, and there are scenes, for as kind of opaque as some of the heroic stories can be, when it comes down to characters fighting each other, nobody can draw an acrobatic fight the way Ditko can. And so when there'd be those pages of, say, like Hero or the Interrobang or something, flipping around and punching somebody, and the punches are always those circular explosion of dots when they hit somebody. I mean, that's
right. That point of impact.
There's the little, the Ditko fan in me got really excited when those pages would show up, and that's even into the later issues. Probably one of my favorite stories out of all the stories in the books that we read is in issue 20, and that's the Hero and the Exploder, which is a pretty straightforward action story that you don't see that much in these books. But the hero is fighting a guy who has these kind of explosive powers, and the hero solves a problem. He figures out how to combat these explosive powers and wins. And it's a pretty straightforward superhero story, but it is really effective. And again, especially in the art.
As you were talking, and you were talking about the art and the emphasis on abstraction in many of the stories, that caused me to think of something that we've referenced before, but we really haven't discussed, and that is the E&I stories. Mm-hmm. And there are a few of those, Ed and Ida. And so I fished out the first instance of E&I, which is Ditko Act 8, Issue 13. And there's also one of my favorites of the entire run in here, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to talk about the first example of E&I. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but when I read this, and especially when I got to the end, I immediately thought Samuel Beckett.
Oh, yeah.
This is Ditko. The E&I storyline is Ditko at his most Beckett-esque, Beckettian, whatever adjective we want to use there. And so here you have basically what the premise of these E&I stories is. We have characters who are named Ed and Ida, and there are many characters who are named Ed and Ida. Every character is named either Ed or Ida. So as this one begins, we find a couple of people, or a few people, arguing over work that they're doing, and some are called Ed, the males, and then the women are called Ida. Yeah. Then something goes on where there are shots behind the office door, and then there are two people who are working in this building, one a male, one a female. The male working in the building is called Ed, and the female is called Ida. And then soon after, so they're wondering what's going on inside of this office where they hear gunshots. And then police officers, a male and female, come to the scene and they go, "What's up?" And the male is named Ed and the female police officer is named Ida. And so you get a repetition of the names Ed, Ida, Ed, Ida, over and over again, to where it becomes very nonsensical. And that's absurd. And that's what led me to think of this as very much like a Samuel Beckett play or even a story. I was thinking of an early novel, and one of the few that was originally published in English of his, Watt, because Watt has another character antagonist called Not. Mm-hmm. And so there's the play throughout the book on What Not. And there's something similar going on here, and it's Ditko having fun. But in this first installment of E&I especially, things begin to break down, not only in terms of the language, where the repetition of Ed and Ida becomes almost nonsensical to the point that things don't make sense, and they have no meaning anymore. But even the art becomes much more simple and abstract as you get. I mean, you got the characters in the story that have no faces by the last page.
Mm-hmm.
But then that other story in issue 13 that I just happened to come across, and this is one that's not part of an ongoing storyline, so it's a rarity in this series. This is You Won't Ever Forget. I don't know if you remember this one. This is a guy, kind of a shady character who bumps into a guy who has this kind of a silly-looking grin on his face. And the guy who has the grin is following this shady character. And so the character says, "Why are you following me?" He says, "I've never hid my face from you. You can kill me. You'll never be free of my face. It will be with you all your life." And so this guy kills the guy who has this kind of silly grinning face, and the silly grinning face follows him to the end of the story in very twisted ways. But and one of the reasons why I like this is this plays into the mask motif that we were discussing earlier. This is another one of those mask narratives of Ditko's. And this is also one of those stories that seems to be more crafted and cohesive, which we don't find in a lot of these. It seems to follow a more traditional narrative pattern, let's say.
And which issue is that in?
This is Act 8, Issue 13.
Because I was thinking of another kind of standalone story that's independent of the ongoing narratives, and that is in the very last issue we looked at in 21, the very last story, The Explosive Silence, which is an 8-page, literally silent story. There's no dialogue in it whatsoever.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten about that one.
And so we see a character who kind of explodes in violence for some reason, and grabs a gun and kills some people, and then as he's on the run, a police officer shoots him, and the mob comes in and kills the police officer. And this is, again, very similar to the kind of philosophies that Ditko expresses in other stories, where the criminal element is being coddled by the public, who have more sympathy for people who commit crimes than they do for the victims of crimes, and therefore they retaliate here against the police officer for, doing his job. And so, again, the mob becomes a part of the problem. One of the ways in which Ditko presents the population, the general population, but I think this is a kind of pure example of a kind of story that shows up a lot, because very often we don't see the motives or the reasons why a criminal decides to commit a crime in many of these stories. They just do, and sometimes we don't even actually know also what the crime is. They just want to do something, and the cape comes in, for example, and absorbs the person, and then we get the outcome. But there is in a sense a kind of abstraction of evil that happens in a lot of these stories, where it's not pinned down exactly what it is that motivates the person to do what they're doing.
Right, and that feeds into what seems to be Ditko's philosophy, life philosophy, is that, you really don't need to understand any kind of backstory. You don't need the context of why someone does something that is evil. I mean, the fact that they do things that are evil or in a villainous manner without any regard to another individual or another individual's freedom in any way, that's what you need to know.
Right.
Because any context then would make you akin to, the Gray Negotiator, or let's say the various social workers that appear every now and again in some of these stories, who try to understand the backstory, the context, the way that the environment that the people grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's interesting in issue number 21 that you were pointing out that's silent. And what is the title of it? What was the title of that? The explosion, the explosive silence.
Yeah.
That the inside back cover that's facing the last page of that story is another one of these collection of heads.
Yeah.
Of a mass, and of course, all around them are, I guess in a loose sense, word bubbles or thoughts. I fear hate, the best more than the worst. I'm scared of the highest potential. I'm for envy, hatred of the good for being good. Be against the knower, I demand. A utopia others must make, and so on and so forth. So, yeah. Definitely an interesting read.
Yeah, and I think that we've said some important things about these books. I want to kind of emphasize again that I even find talking about them to be a little bit of a struggle, because I feel like there's several things that are out of bounds that I probably crossed the boundary on, like kind of trying to guess at what Ditko was thinking when he did something. That would definitely be something within the way that he views fans would not be acceptable, right? Or would be worthy of criticism, right? The work is what it is. It's on the page. It's said the way it is going to be said. So to try to extrapolate from that any further is not necessarily going to get you anywhere.
Right, exactly. And that's a dilemma, I think, as a comics reader and a comics scholar and a comics critic who is approaching Ditko's work, because basically what you just said is, we're asking ourselves to bring kind of a different critical context to the work of Ditko than we would to almost any other creator that we would discuss. Mm-hmm. And so then I have to ask myself, is that fair? And does that make of Ditko a special case to where, if that's the end result, then how different is his situation from those that he seems to be critiquing in many of these comics of his? On the other hand, or all of that being said, I don't want to be the critic that we find beginning on page 37 of the Ditko Public Service Package number 2. Nothing anyone does is ever good enough for me. I am a comic critic.
Right. I am. That is probably the place in which my concern for that to how to approach these books started. But
I agree with you. I do think that we ought to keep a number of things in mind as we read this, and maybe take him on his own terms.
Yes.
Which is, again, this is a classic line that Henry James I keep coming back to in the classes that I teach. He says you take the artist on his domain, right? And what he's attempting to do, that's how you should appreciate and understand the work of art. And I think that we're trying to do that here in discussing these Ditko stories. On the other side of that, again, are we asking ourselves to treat him differently than we would any other creator?
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like in a lot of ways I ran into this sort of thing when dealing with Alan Moore, especially when we were talking about the last the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen century. Mm-hmm. That that in that book, Moore is presenting an argument about 20th century popular culture, And so you have to, I felt I had to kind of engage with that book based on that argument. And, with Ditko's work, so much of it is so didactic in nature that it feels like you have to engage with it on that level and less on an aesthetic level.
Right.
Though, like I said before, there are moments when, when Hero is flipping around and beating up some bad guys that I was looking at that and saying, yeah, this is what I like. This is the kind of thing that Ditko does that I like. So yeah, and so I think in kind of a wrap up too, the getting back to the Kickstarter issue. So there's a variety of ways to get Ditko's new material. DCB Service is one of the distributors, probably one of the most high-profile ones. There are a few other websites in which it's available on, but now, following issue number 19, there have been, I think, a total of, I had this down, 7 Ditko Kickstarters. Let's see if I have this right.
It's something like that. That sounds about right.
9. Oh. Yeah. With the Mr. A one being the most recent. And with the promise in the back of that issue 24 is coming, along with another reprint book. So the main way to get the Ditko stuff as it comes out is to keep an eye out for the Kickstarter campaigns, and to find different ways to help support it. And basically for the Mr. A book, it was, in order to get the book itself, the minimum pledge was $15, and you got the book plus a few other things as well. But anywhere down to $1 even, you get acknowledged in the book.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry I missed out on that. I'll have to keep my eyes open on future Ditko Snyder Kickstarter campaigns.
Yeah.
So we covered a lot of ground in discussing all of these Ditko's self-published comics, and there's a lot to chew on, and we only touched the surface. There is so much more that we could have gone into. This would have really been a long episode had we done that. But you mentioned the Kickstarter. You can also find many of the titles that we discussed at the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. And in fact, if you go there and do a search on various Ditko titles, you'll see that a variety of these, even older ones, you can still get. Sometimes they're reprints. So, for instance, you can find Ditko Oh No, Not Again at 30% off cover price. So that's a really great deal. Also, Ditko Act 2, Act 7, Act 8, Act 4. They have a lot of this stuff still in stock that you can find it anywhere from 35% off to 30% off at the cover price. So Discount Comic Book Service is a great place to get your comics, as we all know, Ditko and otherwise. And after you do get your comics there, please do get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see in the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to our podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at @2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us in other areas of the social media world, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can check out our shows that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find, as always, every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. So, Andy, I had a good time discussing Steve Ditko stuff. I feel that I have to go now and digest it even more.
Okay, well, enjoy the digestion.
Yeah. And until our next episode, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.